Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first in our very exciting series of guest talks from friends and colleagues and supporters from the aviation, aerospace and flying community. And this morning, we're really very pleased to welcome Chris Heames, who's been a great friend of the charity over the years. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Chris about his career flying both in the RAF and also what he does in his spare time, flying sailplanes and formation aerobatics. So that's brilliant. But just before we introduce Chris and our guest adjudicator, who's John Windover, Vice Chairman of Aerobility, it's just really for me to say, well done everybody for putting up with these really strange times. And it's great that Aerobility can hopefully be something positive and something that will keep us connected to the flying world, something we all love so much. As you might imagine, Aerobility is really working hard to sort of change how we deliver our activities. And thanks for being part of that. Thanks for coming along today and enjoying what we're doing. I would say that one thing we must keep on top of is the fundraising. We've got to keep the charity going during these difficult times. So if you've enjoyed today and you do have the chance to make a small donation that will really help us to carry on doing what we're doing, if you go to Just Giving and search for Virtual Aerobility, you can make a donation which will be gift aided as well. That will really help us during these times. But without further ado, I would like to hand you over to John and Chris for our session today. Right, just bear with me while I click the right button. Here we go. Hello, John. Can you hear me okay?
I can indeed, Mike. Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. So as Mike said, as we're all locked up like caged animals, and most of us are pilots, and the sun is shining, what better way to try and feed our obsession by talking airplanes for the next few weeks, and who knows, maybe this will catch on, and we'll get used to doing these sessions virtually. And of course, the great thing, whilst being locked up, is we can capture all of these interesting characters who otherwise are going to be particularly busy flying around the country and occupying themselves in the cockpit rather than in front of a laptop. So it's my pleasure to introduce you all today to Squadron Leader Chris Heames. So Chris has a 30-year career behind him as a Royal Air Force pilot, 13,500 flying hours, everything from small piston-engined tailwheel aircraft up to the mighty F4 Phantom and others. So the challenge today is for Chris and I to try and pack as much as we can in, watch his life fly past before him in an hour's worth of good discussion. And I thought I should kick things off, Chris, by asking you, when did your interest first get sparked in aviation? And Mike, by the way, we can't see Chris at the moment, so you might want to add him to the screen if he's not going to be added already. With
amazing predictability, unfortunately, whether Chris's internet has gone down or he's got a technical hitch, Chris has disappeared from our broadcast.
Okay, well, so I'll let you try and find Chris again, then, Mike. And meanwhile, I can share with you some of the things that I've done with Chris. So, one of the great things about being a general aviation pilot is you do occasionally have the opportunity to have a taste of what it might be like to fly in a fast jet, or to be instructed using the vast experience of someone like Chris, who's a qualified RAF instructor. And so I first met Chris about 15 years ago at North Weald Airfield, which we all know, which is just north of London. And every spring and every autumn, there was a formation school that was conducted there. And the purpose of this was to allow general aviation pilots to have a taste of formation flying and act as a lead into display flying. So I'd heard about this through a good friend, Sam Watmo, and Sam later became an instructor there. But what was a really good experience for me was to take my airmanship and my flying skills to the next level, and to start to learn things about myself and about the aircraft I was flying that I never realized was achievable. For about 10 years, I was a student there every spring and every autumn, having some amazing flying experiences. And that allowed me to achieve my display authorization and become part of a display team. And so without Chris's guidance and mentorship, that just wouldn't have happened. And the really interesting thing is that the syllabus that we all flew by was modeled on the Tucano conversion course. So it was using all the basic principles of formation flying, SOPs, standard operating procedures, and the checks that you would otherwise not use if you were flying with just on your own. So a really interesting experience. I've also had the privilege to fly with Chris in a Hawker Hunter, the T-Bird, the two-seater. You might remember around about 2010, 2011, we had a display team called Team Viper on the UK airshow circuit, and they were flying a quartet of Strike Masters, and the name Team Viper comes from the engine, the Rolls-Royce Viper engine that was the power plant for the aircraft. And there was a guy by the name of Gerald Williams, who's a good friend and a good friend of the charity, who thought it would be a brilliant idea to set up a civilian jet formation aerobatic team. And surprise, surprise, Chris stepped up to the plate, bringing his vast experience in terms of formation instruction, and was able to put this team on the UK airshow circuit. And they had 2 very successful years, and then followed on by a transition onto the Hunter. So there was 4 Hunters that maintained the same display team name, but obviously changed their mount. And there was 4 different marks of Hunter. Chris again was at the helm, and just did an amazing job. I mean, the team went as far as the Middle East. They went to Abu Dhabi, displayed out there, up to Scotland at RAF Lucas, all around the UK, and really did have a fantastic season. But for me, the great memory was stepping in on a practice display during the Waddington Air Show in 2011. And on this particular day, it was a Friday, the sun was shining. It was just a beautiful, beautiful day for flying, a packed air show on the Friday because of the practice day. Everyone's getting their display validations. And Chris said, come on, hop in. I was very lucky to step into the lead jet. And because Scampton was quiet, the Red Arrows were busy somewhere else, and we got to do our practice display over Scampton. I think one of my all-time memories in aviation was sat next to Chris in the T-Bird Hunter, looping over Scampton and looking over my right shoulder and then my left, and seeing 2 other Hunters on our wing as we looped over the top of arguably one of the most famous Royal Air Force stations that there has ever been. Of course, that station having launched the famous Dam Busters mission in May 1943. So I suppose those are the 2 things that stand out for me. But of course, I've also been on the ground watching Chris fly as a spectator. And I have to say, whatever Chris turns his hand to, it's a joy to watch. He really does understand, I think, what is very important in display flying, which is not necessarily showing yourself off as the pilot, but showing the aircraft off in the best possible way, and flying that aircraft in the display routine that is suitable to the aircraft type. So you're not doing unlimited or attempting unlimited aerobatics in an airplane that doesn't have that capability, or not flying it so aggressively in such an aircraft as a Spitfire, perhaps. Now, I do know one secret that Chris only tells a few people, but you all know it now, is that I think his ambition is to fly a Spitfire. So who knows? Maybe he can turn his graceful flying to an aircraft that is ideally suited. And speaking of the man, here he is, Chris. So we've just...
Morning, John. Sorry about the faff.
No problem at all, Chris. Absolutely fine. I've just been talking about our flying experiences together in my yak, and also the opportunity that we had for a display practice that day at Waddington in 2011, I think it was, when we took the foreship over the top of Scampton. So just reminiscing there on the days of RAF Waddington and Formation School. But look, let's get to it, Chris. I've introduced them all to you. I've said that you're a legend of aviation, 13,500 hours, 30 years in the RAF, and still going strong, having retired from the RAF. But where did it all start? So my first question is, when did you first become interested in aviation, and when was your first flying experience?
Interest in aviation, I think, was there from the very start. Like most kids, I used to build plastic models of aeroplanes and paint them and hang them off the ceiling. My first flying experience, though, was I had a paper round when I was about 14, 15, and I got enough money during the week to pay for 3 launches in a glider at the weekend. So I used to cycle to my local gliding club, the Swindon Gliding Club at South Marston Airfield, which is now a Honda test track. And I used to get 3 launches a week if I was lucky in a T21 glider. But the first proper flying experience was in a Chipmunk with the Air Training Corps at RAF Filton, as it was then.
Fantastic. Well, that was actually my first flying experience as well. Not at Filton, but at Manston on the Chipmunk as well. So there we go. And then you took a rather unconventional route into the cockpit, I understand. So you were an air traffic controller, is that right?
I started off as an engineer. I joined the Air Force straight from school on a thing called the University Cadetship Scheme. And so I ended up doing an engineering degree at Newcastle University, but I did a sort of foreshortened course. I only did a 1-year. So then I couldn't be an engineer in the Air Force, and they offered me traffic control. So I went through Henlow to do the officer training, and then through Shawbury to become a controller.
And how did that crossover occur then? What was the? Did you just keep banging on the door, or did they invite you to go into pilot training? How did that come about?
It was a coincidence in a lot of ways. During my I did 3 tours in air traffic. Initially at Wadisham with Lightnings, and then in Cyprus at Akrotiri, and then at Brawdy before it closed. And during that time, I got to do quite a lot of flying. And I used to do the weather check every morning at Brawdy with the station commander. And the station commander wrote a very nice letter to the Air Force Board suggesting that they can reconsider me for pilot training. That was in 1979, and it coincided with a time when the Air Force were desperately short of pilots. So I sort of snuck in through the black door when I was 28.
All right, so right place, right time. And what was the route you took for your initial flying training?
Well, by the time I started flying training, I had over 1,000 hours on gliders. Quite a lot of gliding instructing. So they sent me straight to Linton. I didn't have to go through the Chipmunk Flying Selection Squadron at Swinderby. I went straight to Linton on Ouse. So my first training trip was in a Jet Provost Mark III. So I did 100 hours on the JP3, 60 hours on the JP5, and then on to the Hawk at Valley and tactical weapons at Chivner.
And how did the streaming work in those days, Chris? Because obviously, you know, we're in a multi-role world now. We've got 2 frontline fast jet types. It's a relatively tight, you know, line that you take. But in those days, how did the streaming work, and where did you end up?
Well, at the end of Chivner, you were either assessed as a single seat pilot or multi-crew aircraft. So you either went to the single seat was basically Jaguar, Lightning or Harrier, and only the top guys went to the Harrier, And then multi-seat, you either went to Buccaneer or Phantom. So I was streamed single seat, so I went and I was streamed to go to the Lightning.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to have to, surely we're going to have to spend a few minutes on the Lightning. First impressions when you got to, was it Binbrook you went to? And what happened?
Yeah.
And tell us about the first day in the first flight.
Well, I arrived at Binbrook at a bad time because they tried to put a digital radar attached to an analog simulator, and the simulator was down for a year. So we basically spent about a year in limbo, waiting for the simulator to become serviceable, which it eventually did. And during that time, I got a little bit of flying on air tests and empty seats in the two-sticker. But at the end of that time, the sim became serviceable, and we started the conversion training. My initial impression of the aeroplane was it was huge. It was a 12-foot climb up the ladder to get into this little tiny cockpit. And if you turn around and look backwards, you had this vast aeroplane behind you. It struck me that it was just a really big machine, much bigger than anything I'd flown before.
And what did the course comprise of? I mean, I suppose the simulators in those days couldn't deliver the same level of synthetic training as we have now. So was it mostly in the cockpit?
Yeah. There were two phases to the course. There was the conversion to type, where you flew the aeroplane, you did an instrument rating, you did some formation, just some general flying in the aeroplane to convert onto the aeroplane. And then there was the radar phase, where you learned how to do intercepts and how to do visual idents. So it was two phases to it, and it took basically a year to go through the whole thing.
Yeah.
The sim was just a box with, when the lid came down, it was all blacked out. There were no visuals of any kind. It was basically an aid to learning how to operate the radar and the aircraft systems.
And how about the first solo?
Well, it's the first solo. You got airborne from Binbrook, and Spurn Point was about 15 miles away, and the idea was to go to Spurn Point at about 30,000 feet, put the burners in, and get the aeroplane as fast as you dared, and then you turn around, go to Spurn Point, back 3 circuits, and land. It took about 25 minutes, but you get up to about Mach 1.6.
And then in terms of endurance, I mean, that's probably all the aircraft could muster before you had to come back for fuel.
Yeah, the aeroplane, the Mark III and the T5 with a big engine, small fuel. You had, I think it was just 5,600 pounds of fuel, and in full reheat you could burn 1,600 pounds a minute, and you had to land with 1,600 pounds. So you could actually run out of fuel in 2.5 minutes if you tried very hard.
Yeah,
it was. You learned about fuel management when by flying the aeroplane.
I'm sure. So what happened next? So you're on the Lightning course.
I got to the very end of the radar phase, and I wasn't doing particularly well, so I got chopped on the very last flight of the conversion. And after a short break, I was sent on to the Phantom. During the break, I started flying with the Air Experience flight at 7AF at Newton, as it was then. And I was still flying with them 35 years later when I eventually retired. So I flew with 7AF the whole time I was a pilot in the Air Force, except for the time I was in Germany.
No, that's a wonderful story. And I know we're going to talk about the Air Cadets in a little while, but every cloud has a silver lining. The mighty F4 Phantom, what a machine. I mean, obviously that's an aircraft that defended our skies for a good 20 or 30 years. Where did you end up then? So you've done your AEF flying, you're keeping yourself current on stick time, not necessarily a similar type of aircraft. What happened after Binbrook?
Well, I was flying the Chipmunk with the AEF, and then I went. I did a very short refresher at Broady with a bit of weaponeering and a bit of combat, and then onto the. It was 64 Squadron then. It was the Phantom OCU at Coningsby, and I went through the course there. I did reasonably well. I won the best pilot award and the combat award. And I was posted to 19 Squadron at RAF Wildenrath in Germany, which was fantastic. It was a wonderful place to be, RAF Germany. But flying the Phantom in the low-level air defence role was just a dream. I had to pinch myself on a daily basis to believe that I was actually doing it. It was fantastic.
Yeah, I'm sure. And in terms of flying for the Royal Air Force in RAF Germany compared to the UK, I mean, this is Cold War.
Yep.
So there's obviously, part of a NATO organization. I mean, what was the mission type that your squadron was charged with?
It was purely air defence. The RAF had the part of the task of policing the inner German border. So there was a border between East and West Germany. So there was the border itself. There was a buffer zone, and then there was an area called the ADIS, which was the Air Defence Interception Zone, and we policed that. So about once a week or once a fortnight, you would be on battle flight, which is quick reaction alert, and you had to be airborne within 5 minutes, day or night, and you could fly supersonic overland across Germany to intercept anybody who was compromising the inner German border.
Yeah.
So that was the operational part of it. But the rest of the time, we flew low-level caps, combat air patrols over various areas of Germany where there were low-flying areas, and you could intercept anybody who came along. So normally we'd either have a pair or a four ship on cap, and you just intercepted anybody who came along. And of course there were 2 Harrier squadrons, there were either 4 or 6 Jaguar squadrons. The Tornado was coming in, so we had 3 or 4 Tornado squadrons. There were Buccaneer squadrons. There were an awful lot of airplanes flying low level around Germany, and whenever you got airborne, you would end up in a fight within the first 5 minutes of being on cap. And you're maneuvering this 30,000 pound weight airplane. I think that the Phantom got airborne at something like 20 tons, and you're throwing this airplane around at low level in multiple aircraft dogfights.
Yeah. And did you ever get any? Did you ever stare eye to eye with any Eastern Bloc aircraft? Because I know that there was the odd, fracas across the border.
No. I think in those days everybody behaved themselves very nicely, and they stayed on their side of the border and we stayed on ours. I don't think there was any border infractions at all. But whenever you got airborne, you had to be very careful, because our primary nav aid was a TACAN, tactical. It's basically a VOR DME. But the Soviets had a way of changing the bearing so that they could try to get you to fly across the border. We had an inertial navigation system as well, but it wasn't like the modern systems where it talks to a moving map. It had to be interpreted by the nav, and you had to be very careful not to get seduced across the border.
Now, there was a story that you were telling us in the bar some years ago about a day that it all went wrong for you in a Phantom.
We got dragged into work at about 3 o'clock in the morning for a generation exercise. That's where the engineers had to get every aeroplane serviceable and fully loaded, and we used to do that regularly, and sometimes it was a sort of precursor to an exercise, but often it was just a generation exercise that then finished and we all went home again. But at the end of the generation exercise, there was an airplane that needed an inverted flight test. the engineers had lost something inside it, and so it had to be taken up and turned upside down, and I volunteered to do it. And while we were doing it, we had a fairly minor failure, which was called a utilities failure. It's one of the hydraulic systems on the aeroplane broke. So we were positioning ourselves to go back into Wildenrath when the aeroplane pitched up violently and uncontrollably. And as the aeroplane was going up, I told the navigator to eject. And as he ejected, the nose of the aeroplane came down, and I thought I'd got control back again, because the controls felt completely normal and it felt as though the aeroplane was responding, but it wasn't, and it slowed violently, and the aircraft went into a flat spin, which anybody who knows the Phantom will know that a flat spin is irrecoverable, because the spin is recovered by, first of all, putting out the drag chute, which pitches the nose down, and then you can start to aerodynamically recover the aeroplane. But a flat spin is irrecoverable, because when the brake chute comes out, it doesn't deploy properly because the aeroplane is spinning with the nose up. So after wrestling with it for a few seconds, I decided that it was hopeless and ejected. But what had actually happened is that there had been when the hydraulic failure happened, it happened because a pipe had burst, and that started a sort of blowtorch in the back end of the aeroplane, and it burnt through the stabilator input rod, which took away the elevator. So the aeroplane was totally out of the control, and the elevator was at full deflection. So the aeroplane was never gonna recover whatever I did.
Yeah.
So my last impression of that aeroplane is seeing it disappear between my feet with a great jet from the rocket pack, which propels the seat out of the aeroplane.
So you were conscious throughout the whole episode?
I remember every bit of it from the aeroplane. When you pull the handle, there's a delay of about 1 second while the canopy goes. And during that 1 second, I thought that the seat hadn't functioned. Time it was obviously fairly compressed. And I looked down and pulled the handle as hard as I could again. And during that time, it fired. So I went out with my head between my knees as the seat accelerated upwards at 300 G per second.
Yeah.
So I had a very good view of the rocket pack as it went.
Well, there's a story that we can elaborate on in the bar. If anyone's going to be with Chris at some point in a flying club bar, I'm sure there'll be more to talk about with that particular event. How did your days end with the Phantom, Chris?
It was in the bad old days when any board of inquiry worked on the assumption that you were guilty until proved innocent. So it was about 2 weeks before I got cleared to fly again, although I was medically cleared to fly again the next day. And in fact, the next day I was flying gliders at the gliding club. So I was able to fly straight away after the accident, but I got back into a Phantom after 2 weeks. And I was on the squadron for about another 6 weeks after that. And then I was posted to Tornadoes. So I did the conversion course at Cottesmore and then the weapons course at Honington.
Yeah.
And the reason for that, I was told, is that because the F3 or the F2 as it was then was coming in, the Air Force had put lots and lots of Phantom pilots on hold, waiting to start up the F3. But then when the F3 moved to the right by a considerable amount, all these pilots had to be found jobs, and there were no second tours to be had on the Phantom. So it wasn't my choice to go to the Tornado, but it was another great aeroplane, another great flying job. Basically, low level interdiction on the newest aeroplane into the inventory.
So this was in RAF Germany again, is that right, at Bruggen?
Yeah, I did the conversion in the UK, again, which was 2-3 month courses, and then straight back to Germany on 17 Squadron at Bruggen.
So this was now mud moving as opposed to air defending. Was it a different mission?
Yeah, completely different. Mud moving. So we did quite a lot of strafing. We did. We were dropping practice bombs on almost all sorties. We dropped big bombs in Canada and on Garvey Island in the north of Scotland. Lots and lots of tanking. Lots of exercises in the States. So went to Red Flag 3 or 4 times. And every year we went to Canada to do an exercise where we flew around doing formation TF in the dark, which was normally as a 4 aircraft formation, flying around in cloud at 500 feet in the dark.
Not for the faint-hearted.
You learn to believe in the systems. The navigation system in the Tornado was fantastic, and the TF system was utterly reliable as long as you pressed the buttons in the right order and then monitored it very actively.
Now, you talked about Cottesmore. This was the Tri-National Tornado Training Establishment, is that right? The tongue twister, the Triple TE. So, come back from Bruggen to Cottesmore, and then is that where you started instructing on the aircraft?
I did 2 tours in Germany on Tornado. So I did 17 Squadron, and then I crossed over the runway to the other side to 14 Squadron, did another 3 years there. So in all, I did 11.5 years in Germany, with the only break being to come and convert onto the Tornado. And then I was posted to Triple TE as an instructor. So I did a fairly short instructor course there, where you convert to the back seat and learn to deliver the conversion syllabus, and then you teach Germans, Italians, the odd Canadian and American to fly the Tornado. But it was only the flying part of it. The weapons bit was always done at TWICU, Tornado Weapons Conversion Unit at Honington.
Right. Now, not one for a quiet life. You also had your own little drama in the Tornado, I believe, whilst at Cottesmore.
Yeah. Yes, I was flying with a German Navy first tourist who'd only done half a dozen trips on the aeroplane. He was in the front seat, I was in the back, and we were doing an instrument flying sortie, and part of that was to practice a 67 wing approach. So you put the wings all the way back, pretend that they're stuck there, and fly a 67 wing approach. We never ever landed or rolled off that. We only ever came down to 200 feet and then overshot, put the wings forward, turned downwind into the circuit and landed. But when the guy in the front seat selected the wings forward, they didn't move. They were stuck 61 degrees back. So almost fully swept. So the aeroplane, it's that same sort of configuration as a Lightning. The problem with that is none of the flaps or slats work because of the wing sweep mechanism, where the wings go inside the wing glove. It can't go inside there with the flaps and slats working. So the flaps and slats are up. So all you have is a solid slab of wing. So the threshold speed is something like 240 miles an hour. So you have to do something that nobody's ever done before, because nobody practices landing the airplane with the wings back. There's a little bit of guidance in the aircrew manual for it, but basically the airplane, as you get down close to the ground, the airplane doesn't want to land. It comes into ground effect and wants to float. Well, you have to get it. You have to actually physically push it onto the ground and then use the thrust reverse to stop it. But once you get the thrust reverse in and full power on the engines, it stops very, very nicely. So we managed to stop it in 6,000 feet of the 9,000 foot runway.
Impressive! Wow. Yeah. Indeed.
Good result.
Yeah, the one you were looking for. And then you moved on to the F3.
Well, I went from Cottesmore. I went to Linton-on-Ouse and did a full tour instructing on the Tucano. And then after the Tucano, I had this dream of going on to BBMF. So I asked to go on to the F3, and that was the 4th operational type, the 4th OCU that I'd done at the ripe old age of 50. and converted onto the F3 and went to 5 Squadron at Coningsby. So the plan was working quite well up to that point. Unfortunately, the week after I arrived on the squadron, the boss stood up and said that the squadron was closing. So after something like 10 or 11 months on the squadron, I went across to 11 Squadron at Leeming. And I did a year and a bit on 11 Squadron, and then I went on to the NAV training squadron as part of CFS at Cranwell. And I was there for a couple of years, and then I went, and my last 8 years was as the chief instructor at the Central Gliding School at Sarston. So,
and as far as
training the people who train the air cadets.
Exactly. Well, it's closing the loop, isn't it? I mean, it must be very rewarding to have done what you've done on the front line, flown the types you've flown, and then have the ability to encourage and inspire the next generation and actually understand what's ahead of them. You know, it must be a very interesting way of closing your flying career in the Royal Air Force.
Yeah. It was nice. By the time I left the front line, flying frontline fighters is pretty intensive. So I was ready to leave it when I left, but I was lucky. I was still flying frontline fighters at the age of 53, which was not too bad.
Yeah, very good, very unusual.
Yeah. And flying 4 different types it will never happen again because we already got 2 types. But having flown 4 different types of operational airplane was great. And
then obviously I think gliding is where the heart is for yourself, Chris. With the hours, I got down here 3,500 hours gliding, and of course that's where you started your flying. Tell us a bit about your gliding career, both in the Air Force and out the Air Force, where you've been, memorable moments, and a bit about the aircraft that you've flown as well.
Well, I think I've flown all the aeroplanes that the RAF GSA have, and a pile of others as well. I think gliding is a fantastic way to fly. It's a very pure way to fly, and whatever you achieve is because you can look out the window and read the weather and try to make the best use of what's going on in the atmosphere so that you can prolong the flights you do. I've done some fantastic flying in the Alps. I'm sure Mike will tell you endless stories about flying in the Alps, which is just absolutely brilliant, because we were very lucky. Whenever we went to the Alps, we went with a guy called Bill Malpass, who was a retired RAF squadron leader, but he taught us the methodology of flying in the Alps, which is basically that you fly to a little hill, and once you've conquered that hill, you can go to a bigger hill, and eventually you can end up in the really big mountains and you fly 100 miles north, you get to Mont Blanc, and you can climb up Mont Blanc and get over the top of it. So you're flying around. Once you've sort of got yourself going on the day, you can get yourself up to sort of 10,000 feet plus, and you cruise around these massive mountains. There's wave systems that set themselves up where, if you go through half a dozen little stepping stones, you can get yourself up to 25,000 feet in mountain wave over fantastic landscapes. And I was very lucky that I actually went to Chile with the RAF GSA on a number of occasions and flew in the Andes, which is similar to flying in the Alps, but it's just another level of magnitude higher. It's just bigger and better flights. And in Chile, we were very lucky to be flying with experts from the Chilean Air Force who showed us the same sort of techniques that we were using in the Alps and how to apply them in the Andes. And in the Andes, we were flying at just shy of 30,000 feet, very close to the highest mountain in the Andes, which is Aconcagua. And we were about 5,000 feet above the top of it. And that's the top of that's around 25,000 feet. It's just massive. But there was some wonderful experiences there, because you fly along when you get into the big mountains, there are condors up there, and they're wonderful placid creatures, and they just sit, 5 or 10 feet off your wingtip, and look around and look at you with disdain as you're struggling to do what they can do.
Incredible. And what sort of endurance of some of these flights? I mean, obviously it takes time to get to altitude, and then you've got to think about the altitude in terms of human factors, and you're obviously taking oxygen with you. I mean, give us a bit of a perspective on how different that type of gliding is compared to the sort of gliding we have at home.
Well, you can do high altitude gliding here. I mean, people fly in at Aboyne in Scotland and regularly get up near 30,000 feet. So the difficulties of flying at those heights is dealing with the cold. You have to dress very carefully to make sure that your extremities don't get cold. But the length of flight is basically due to is down to how long you can concentrate for, and how long you can physically fly. The airplane gliders in excess of 9 hours on flights across Europe. I was very lucky to go with a friend to Gibraltar and fly out of Gibraltar into North Africa and fly around the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, landing back at Gibraltar at night. But when we finished the expedition, we flew the aeroplane all the way back to Abbeville in France, in 4 legs, basically. We stopped in the Pyrenees for 3 days and flew at a place called Jaca, and flew along the Pyrenees, which was fantastic. But the longest flight I did was from Madrid all the way up into the Pyrenees, by way of Zaragoza, and that was 9 3/4 hours.
Wonderful! So what an experience!
That was quite a long day.
Yeah,
absolutely. You can see in the pictures that the oxygen system is the same as an oxygen system in an airplane. That little lake there is an active volcano called Tupungato, and it's got a little his little sister next door called Tupungatito, and you can see the sort of sulfurous gas oozing out of the ground, and that's at around 17,000 feet up.
Incredible. And so obviously you've you're in the twilight years of your RAF career, and you've made RAF Syerston your home, I believe. So what were you doing there? And obviously this is very much driven around the Air Training Corps, which you described earlier.
It was called ACCGS, the Air Cadet Central Gliding School. So it basically mirrored the Central Flying School in the Air Force. When I was there, we had 27 squadrons subordinate to us, and those squadrons were either equipped with the Grob 103, which the Air Cadets call the Viking. It's called an Acro in civilian life, but it was called a Viking, or the Vigilant, which was the Grob 109 motor glider. There's 27 squadrons, and every year the objective was to try and send 2,000 kids on their first ever solo in an airplane in one of those 2 types. So we trained all of the instructors to instruct on those airplanes, and then taught them to be better and better instructors as they went up through the various categories of instructor. So we had to examine them out in the field. So we went to all of the gliding schools, as they were called, and tested the instructors for the standard of their instruction, and also the standardization of their instruction. And probably about a third of the time, you would get a kid who arrived at Syerston, and you would have a whole week to get the kid up to solo standard and send them off on their own, which was always, that was the icing on the cake. That was the cream of the job as far as I was concerned.
Yeah. And then obviously those that are watching and listening may have seen in the media recently that Aerobility have become the proud owners of about 63 Grob 109s recently. And you can read about this on our website, and you'll be able to see it in the mainstream media. But we are thrilled to be able to put these Grub 109s back into the air, because some of you may be aware that these aircraft were grounded whilst in RAF service, and it was really in the balance what was going to happen to these airframes, and obviously the continuation of flying for the air cadets, those hours that were lost. My daughter's in the air cadets, and you know, there's still a hole in terms of the number of hours these kids can fly. But it's a wonderful story, and it's brought us together, Chris, in other means with IACT. So tell us a bit about IACT and what you're up to there.
IACT is a bunch of people who are trying to export the UK Air Cadet training model to other interested parties. We got very close to starting up an organization in Albania which would service all of the Balkan countries, but obviously coronavirus has set all that back probably about a year. But the idea is to model these organizations on UK Air Cadets, and IACT is trying to market that model worldwide. It's a brilliant concept, because for instance, in Albania, for the price of a bottle of water for each tourist who goes to Albania, you can run an air cadet organization in perpetuity. You know, there's 3 million visitors a year. 3 million bottles of water is 3 million euros, and that will very easily service 2 gliding squadrons at 2 different bases, plus air cadet squadrons in all the centers of population, and develop a bunch of air-minded kids who will become the air traffic controllers and aircraft engineers and pilots of the future. So that's the idea of the organization, and it's I think it's a tremendous thing that Britain has to offer, that we can export to these places.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny, isn't it? You know, before you get to that inspirational stage of having them touch or feel aviation, it's about access and opportunity. And I think that's what that organization is providing, is you've got to have the means for these kids to experience and taste it, and then comes the benefits of that opportunity to inspire them into aviation. So no, great job. So obviously outside of the Air Force, and I think there's a bit of civil flying going on in the twilight years of your RAF career. We met at North Weald in 2006, I think it was, on the formation school. Tell us a bit about your extracurricular flying outside of the RAF, and I suppose the formation school is a good place to start.
Yeah, a great friend, Andy Gent and Steve Newjane, started up the formation school in North Weald to provide a sort of vehicle for civilian pilots to learn how to do formation flying in a controlled and structured way, so that they would be able to enter the UK Airshow circuit as properly qualified formation pilots. 2 years after it all started up, Andy Gent invited me to go down there as a sort of guest instructor. And I then flew there for about 22 years, I think it was, before the activities sort of diminished. And it was a brilliant concept. Each pilot came with a 2-seat aeroplane with 2 parachutes, 2 headsets, and an empty seat, and an RAF instructor would be put in the back seat, and you'd teach them all of the fundamentals of formation flying. And the guys who've been there 2 or 3 times were able to do formation aerobatics very, very competently and safely by the end of 2 or 3 visits.
And of course, notably, there's 1 or 2 teams that did indeed spawned from the formation school. The Aerostars is one, and of course Team Viper. So tell us a bit about Team Viper and how that came about, and you know, what the aircraft mount was initially.
Yeah, well, Team Viper was the sort of brainchild of a guy called Gerald Williams, who is a brilliant guy, a true aviation enthusiast. And he'd flown all sorts of vintage jets and ended up owning a Strike Master, and thought it would be a great idea if we could put a Strike Master team on the display circuit. So he talked to other Strike Master owners who were all on board, and we put together Team Viper, which was a 4-ship of BAC Strike Masters, which is a brilliant aeroplane for airshow flying, because it's got it's well endowed with power. I don't think they've ever built an aeroplane with too much power, but the Strike Master has got a good amount of it. So Gerald asked me to lead the team. So I led the team in an aeroplane that belonged to another friend called Stephen Partridge Hicks. And I flew that aeroplane all around the UK airshow circuit. We flew the aeroplanes out to Bahrain for the first ever Bahrain airshow, where we were operating over the Grand Prix circuit next to Shakira Airport. And then we flew the aeroplanes on to Abu Dhabi for the Al Ain Air Show. And then while we were there, we also were fluffers for the Red Bull Air Race in Abu Dhabi. The Red Bull Air Race goes up and down a strip of water in the city called the Corniche. And Gerald and I flew 2 Strike Masters twice a day into the Red Bull Air Race arena and did an 8-minute display in 2 Strike Masters, which was some of the best flying I've ever done. It was fantastic fun.
Yeah, wonderful experience.
And then the airplane came back. Yeah. I think they photoshopped that photograph so that I wasn't shorter than all the rest. But that's Team Viper. That's my helmet, my old 11 Squadron visor cover on it. But right at the end of the Strike Master era, we flew a formation of 2 Hunters and 2 Strike Masters at the Waddington Air Show one year, which was very, very popular. But after that, we then became a 5-ship with 5 Hunters. 3 of them were 2 of them were 2 stickers. So I led in the camouflage 2 sticker, but then, and that aeroplane you saw there is Victor Echo Tango Alpha, and then there was a Mark 9, which is a big engine single-seater, and 2 small engine single-seaters. But we flew a 5-ship formation. First gig we did was back at Al Ain with 4 Hunters, so we flew them all the way out there, and then we put together this 5-ship display team. And bearing in mind that the Red Arrows get 6 months and 4 flights a day to practice ready for the season, we managed to do all of our practicing in a week. We only did about half a dozen sorties. But then after that, we practiced in between every display, because it was so expensive to put the Hunters on the display circuit. We would do a display typically for a small amount of money and a lot of fuel, and we would then use that fuel to practice and do another practice on the way to the next display. And that way we could keep our display practicing up without massive cost.
Yeah, I think the word cost and Hunter display team in the same sentence is quite a scary proposition, isn't it? But yeah. I mean, I know it was really well received by the great British public. It really was in many ways a first as well. I mean, that many Hunters together looping probably hadn't been done for many years. So no, absolutely memorable times, that's for sure. And then you moved on to another display team, the Global Stars, which is what you're up to now, I believe.
a friend called Mark Jeffries had put this team together, and my first exposure to it was in India. We were participating in the World Formation Aerobatic Championship at Zhengzhou in China. So Mark asked me if I would fly with the team, so that we could compete in the World Formation Aerobatic Championships. So we were doing a display at Vijayawada in Italy, in India. So we used that as a practice session for Zhengzhou. So we devised a display and then practiced it and then presented it at Vijayawada. And that very same display was then done in May in Zhengzhou in the championship, and we managed to come second.
Fantastic. And I believe that Mike's got a video of the Global Stars that he can show us. Well, so I mean, you know, in terms of taking a 4-ship air display to that part of the world, which for them is a complete novelty. I mean, how were you received, and what were the challenges you faced in terms of just, you know, getting the aircraft in the air and flying the display?
Well, the logistics are horrendous, because you have to take the aeroplanes apart, stick them in you put 2 in a 40-foot container, and then they go to, I think it's either Hamburg or Hanover on a lorry, and they get on a train and go to China, and they end up in China. Then they go on a lorry to the airfield, and all of that needs a lot of planning, because there's customs and all sorts to do it at either end. And then you get yourself allocated 2 people to an airplane, which is basically a pilot and an engineer. And then we put the airplanes together, flight test them, practice the display, and then present the display, which is normally 3 displays a day for 4 days. And then we take the airplanes to pieces, put them back in the box, and come home again. The video that's queued up there, that's about to run, is we were asked by the Chinese to do some footage for the opening of that bridge, which is the biggest bridge in the world, 26.5 miles between Macau and Hong Kong, and we did the opening ceremony for that, and had a wonderful time in Zhuhai.
Yeah. You got the sound on there, Mike. If you turn the sound down, thanks, Mike. So in terms of turn the sound down there, Mike. Oh, it's gone. In terms of those pyros that some people may have seen you fly with out there, how's that? You're on the 4 position, so you're the box. How's that
flying
on your eyes?
4 position, it's quite a shock the first time, because there are 6 pyros on the 3 aeroplanes in front of you, all very, very bright, so that they can burn through the twilight. So you go from squinting in the gloom to having 6 million candle power in front of you. It's quite a shock, but I mean, the extra is a joy to fly. Flying with a great bunch of guys and doing really demanding shows 3 times a day, I think is it certainly keeps you young. It keeps you it gives you a really, really good challenge.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's for sure.
yeah. So I think I'm very, very lucky to have done all this stuff, and the pyro flying has been exceptionally good fun.
Yeah, no, it just looks fantastic watching it on the screen here. Well, and that just about brings us up to date in terms of what is, you know, a really incredible flying career, Chris, and many more years to come, I'm sure. What are you up to at the moment besides the Global Stars? And it seems you spend more time in the air than you do on the ground.
Certainly not for the last week, but I remain ever optimistic. I think it's important that when you've had such a a blessed life in flying that you put as much back into it as you possibly can. So at the moment, I spend a lot of time instructing in vintage jets. So all of the JPs, L29, Nat, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll get some Hunters back again. But I you know, a lot of people have a dream of flying these aeroplanes, and it's nice to be part of that dream and help to facilitate it. So I get a great deal of pleasure from doing that. Although it's quite time consuming in that, if you do go to North Weald for one sortie, that's probably most of a day, because by the time you've got there, briefing takes about an hour. The sortie will take about an hour and a half from walking out to the aeroplane to walking back in. Then there's the debrief and all the write-ups, because you have to keep exceptionally good records of all of this. It's a lot of work, but it's very, very rewarding.
And of course, these people that are going on these sorties are, not from an RAF background. They're not flying as consistently as that aircraft would have been flying them in the Air Force. So I suppose there's a bit of additional focus and time in due diligence. I mean, how do you manage a PPL converting onto a complex jet powered aircraft? I mean, that must bring its own challenges.
It does, because in the Air Force, when you're training people, they've all been sifted through some selection process, and it's a fairly homogenous group. Whereas when you're instructing in a civilian environment, you haven't a clue what you're trying to instruct until you meet them. So you have to learn to tailor your instruction to the ability of the person you're teaching and their capacity to absorb the information you're giving them. So all of the structure that you used when you're teaching in the Air Force is fairly irrelevant. You have to be much more reactive to the person you're flying with.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Nat aircraft just then. So that's another team you're involved with, and having flown this aircraft a number of occasions out of North Weald around the UK display circuit. Tell us a bit about the Nat aircraft and how you came about to fly that.
There was a Nat group at North Weald with 2 or 3 Nats, and their primary instructor, a guy called Willie Hackett, got posted to the States to be the principal test pilot on the F-35 program. So they invited me to become an instructor to help them with their conversion to type, and also keeping them up to speed with the aeroplane. So I did a quick conversion onto the aeroplane, and then I was basically sitting in the cave at the back of the aeroplane instructing on the Nat. But the Nat is a joy to fly. It's a wonderful little aeroplane, and we put a little display team together with 3 Nats, which operated around the UK air show circuit for quite a while. And I think was very, very well received. It's a great aeroplane. It's got a brilliant smoke system, but tragically we had an accident about 5 or 6 years ago. Two of the guys were doing a pairs display up near Liverpool, and one of the aircraft tragically crashed and killed the pilot. A lovely guy and a great friend called Kevin Wyman. So that took the wind out of our sails a little bit, but since then we've displayed the aeroplane a few times, and we'll continue to do so, because the Nat has a fantastic pedigree with the Red Arrows, and it's a great aeroplane in its own right, and I think the UK airshow public like to see it.
Here. No, and I think with the uncertainty that's upon us now in the 2020 display season, let's hope that this allows us to take stock, find the time to consider the future of not only maintaining the UK air display industry, but also those aircraft within it. And I think that the work that I know that you've done, Chris, and others to lobby the CAA and the authorities to to maintain vintage jet operations is to be applauded. So fantastic work. I think that brings us just about to the end. We could chat for hours, couldn't we? Lots of dits, lots of funny stories. I have to say, I can see on the right hand side of my screen here questions, comments. I've got someone, Derek Sharp. Good morning, Chris. Remember your old TW instructor? There's somebody who's come in from the Netherlands who you instructed as well in the Royal Air Force. And I've also got some questions that have come in. So what I was going to do now is just spend the last 5 or 10 minutes throwing some questions at you, because there's a huge list. I'm going to start with the first one here, and that is, of all the aircraft you've flown, what was your favourite?
I think the Phantom. It was the first aeroplane I flew operationally. It was a fantastic role flying around Germany, and it was, I was like a kid with a new toy every day. It was just a fantastic existence. Very, very happy doing that job.
Well, here's a good one. Which aircraft would you like to fly that you haven't yet? Now that implies this aircraft is still out there to be grabbed. And then another question is, what aircraft would you have liked to have flown that you never got the chance to fly?
So I still dream of flying a Spitfire, and I'm still optimistic that I'll get the chance to do that. As far as aeroplanes in the Air Force, that's difficult, because I think I flew.
Have you flown them all?
Airplane I ever want. I would like to have had a crack at the Harrier. I think that might have been quite a strange sensation, flying a fixed wing aeroplane that can hover. I think that would have been quite good fun. But I think I'm pretty content that I've done as many things as I was capable of doing.
Yeah. Right. Another question here is, we may have answered this one already. Scariest moment in a cockpit, notwithstanding perhaps your F4 and Tornado experiences.
I think the scariest thing was I was leading a pair of Tornadoes when a 3-ship of Harriers decided to fly through us, and I have quite a vivid memory of a Harrier flying between the fins of two of the two Tornadoes we were flying. He came right in between us. If he'd have been about 5 feet either way, he'd have probably taken out one of us, which would have probably taken out the other. We were just doing a formation PAR to overshoot, and as we overshot at Larbrook, these 3 Harriers came and savaged us. Luckily, no one was hurt, but it was as close as you would ever want to get.
Absolutely. I've got another message coming here from D Gauntlet. Hello from Dave Gauntlet, ex Phoenix and Two Rivers Gliding Club 90s and Tornado GR1. You're a very popular man here, Chris. There's a long list. We haven't got the time. We'll send them to you.
All people want to get even.
Yeah. 2 last questions. Proudest achievement?
I think surviving this long and having met so many wonderful people in aviation and shared some fantastic memories with some lovely people.
Yeah, wonderful answer. Absolutely, you can't get better than that. I think a lot about aviation is the people, isn't it? It's not just the machines; it's the people that you meet and the experiences that you have. And then the last question here is, if you can remember, highest and fastest you've ever flown.
I think the highest I've ever got is probably, I think, about 56,000 feet in a Phantom. And the fastest was Mach 2.05 in a Tornado F3.
The preserve of just a few people. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. It really has. And it's good to see my mate reciting his life story for the last hour. Thank you. Thanks on behalf of what looks like thousands of people who've dialed into this webcast. So thanks everybody. It's been really good fun. What you'll notice in the top right-hand corner of the screen is the Triumph Motorcycles logo, which I'll bring Mike back in now. Mike can talk to you about that, and I'll let Mike close off. But Chris, thanks ever so much. It's been really good fun, and when we all get released from our isolation, I think we owe you a cup of tea, or maybe we'll go a bit further and have a beer at the Aerobility headquarters at Blackbush. So many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
Right.
guys, thank you very much. Chris, thank you, John. John, firstly, you make a great chat show host. Thank you very much. I think this format works very well. And Chris, it was an absolute pleasure just to delve a little bit into your background, hear about some of the amazing airplanes you've flown, and the calm, cool, collected, and just every man's pilot. I think that's what we can call you. So thank you very much for your help today, and thank you for your time. It was brilliant. And as John mentioned, thank you to Triumph Motorcycles, who are a great supporter of Aerobility, that are supporting us with these talk series. So they'll continue to help us, and watch out for actually some Triumph-related talks coming up, actually. We're hoping to involve some TT riders and some superbike riders who are going to talk about their experiences. So some other pretty impressive machinery to hear about as well. Lastly, just to repeat the appeal, really, thank you for your help and support of Aerobility during these tricky times. Once again, Just Giving, go to Virtual Aerobility, and you can make a small donation to support us, which would be much appreciated. Well, on that note, thanks, guys. Let's head back to normality now, head back to our home offices. Trying times, but we're all doing it together, which is the best thing. So thanks, guys. We'll sign off now. And watch out for social media and the Aerobility website for our next great presentation. Cheers. Bye-bye all.
Bye.